So far, we've been talking about these worldviews as historically significant intergenerational systems of value agreement. And these are the three main ones that I showed in my dialectical spiral slide. There's a couple that are pre-traditional. But these worldviews they're demographically real, right? They have institutions, they have power, they have celebrities, every one of them has an observable, identifiable piece of the culture. But this pattern of worldview emergence, right, building one after the other as I've described, it suggests, of course, that there's something beyond progressivism. So let's go to the next slide. This one, same chart, but at the very top, beyond progressivism in the same timeline or trajectory of emergence, I've got this tiny little worldview, which I'm labeling post-progressive. It's just emerging now. Demographically speaking, it's not even as big as that tiny circle shows. But what it does indicate is that it's why you can see I'm using the term post-progressive, because it's what comes after. It's now that progressivism has emerged as a full-throated antithesis to the establishment of the previous two worldviews. It's signaling the opportunity, right? The negative problematic life conditions that call for the next emergence. And this next emergence, as I show by those blue arrows, what characterizes this next emergence is that it's emerging by trying to better include and appreciate the full spiral of cultural development, the full spectrum. So go to the next slide. Okay, so the big version of that characterization, which I just show as this red-blue yin-yang, just to symbolize that this emergent level, it has a left and a right side naturally. Just like modernity, as we saw, is pulled into the right and the left, this post-progressive worldview, as it emerges, has folks who are able to kind of bring both sides, to preserve what's right and fix what's wrong. And while the tiny little demographic of people who are authentically kind of in this worldview, most of them, like me, are kind of moderately left, I know many people who are authentically integral. I can testify that these folks are developed into this level. They can really see from this perspective, and they are more like center-right. So the idea that this new worldview will contain both sides of the polarity, and it will try to integrate in an ongoing way, is one of the characteristics of this emerging post-progressive or integral worldview. The difference between a post-progressive left and a progressive left is that the post-progressive left, A, can see that it's in an interdependent polarity with some kind of right, even though it may not look like the current right on the political spectrum now. It may not be Trumpism, but it's certainly a permanently recurring form of value orientation, which to make both sides as healthy as they can be, need to be in this continuous process of integration, the continuous process of challenge and support. And so within this worldview space, that challenge and support can take place within this larger agreement structure of interdependence. Right? We've learned the lessons of polarity. We've learned the lessons of cultural evolution and cultural intelligence. And so we're naturally finding that we're in company with folks who don't think like us entirely, but we're able to benefit from the challenge and support that those tensions provide. In my 2007 book, Integral Consciousness, I elaborated each worldview. I mean, my thinking has evolved somewhat since then, but I would still recommend chapter 3 and 4 of that book as more elaborate descriptions of each of these worldviews. And in there, in chapter 4, I focused exclusively on the integral worldview. Like, what does it mean? And it does have some independent values that you can see in less intense forms in earlier worldviews. Like, one of the strong values of this integral worldview is a desire to see a unification, or at least a harmonization, of science and spirituality. You know, it sort of transcends New Age magical thinking, but it recognizes that spirituality, there's something to it. You know, we may not be able to regress to a religious conception of it, but the idea that the universe is simply matter in motion and that it's absurd and there's no larger meaning to it, that kind of, fundamentalist modernist conception of nihilism, that's something that post-progressives, for the most part, are leaving behind. besides this integration of science and spirituality, there's this value of developmental thinking, both and thinking, dialectical thinking. There's an appreciation for that. But if we were to try to list the values of the integral worldview, I think the thing which characterizes it most is that it brings the existing values of the whole spiral. All these other values are brought online, they're lighted up in a new way that makes them, in a sense, that one of the characteristics of this worldview that is it attempts to try to be a better champion of the values of each worldview than the partisans of that worldview themselves. So that because it can appreciate modernity, in some ways even more than modernists, it can recognize that liberal values are like the Cambrian explosion. Because it can appreciate progressive values in a way better than progressives, because it can see how this is a layer of care that we need if we're going to go further. There's ways we can defend the values of the spiral better than the folks who are in those values as their center of gravity themselves. And that's a skill that comes from this ability to bring together, to synthesize all the other values. And so there's all these beautiful traditional values that progressivisms can't access because they're too polarized against it. But those traditional values can be carried forward at the integral level because we can just tell the difference between ethnocentric bigotry and beautiful heartfelt patriotism, right? So there's the integral. It transcends by including, right? It makes this move beyond progressivism because it can metabolize a wider spectrum of values, even though it has some new emergent values of its own. It's really the synthesis of the whole thing is the best way to understand it. And again, as this yin-yang shows, there's this enactment of challenge and support. I mean, another way to think about challenge and support is parenting. I think I mentioned this in week 1 too. Challenge and support is what the ideal parent does, right? You've got to challenge your kids to do their homework, but you want to, love them and snuggle with them and make sure that your love is unconditional. And so there's this, those two things can go together. And again, that's this practice of integrating polarities or the process of cultural intelligence. So let's go to the next slide. So, okay, I showed this at the beginning. This is this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. It's not just integralists who usually characterize this dialectical developmental process as a logarithmic helix, a spiral ascending. And part of that is that every new advance is not simply better. It's not simply more evolved in every way. It makes its advance obliquely, like a kind of sailboat tacking against the wind. It can't sail directly into the wind. It has to. It makes its progress by pushing off against the problems of the previous level. So it sort of sails, partially, away. But the fact that it's contaminated in a way by trying to get away from what was wrong at the previous level means that it's not going straight up. It's not sailing directly into the wind, and it inevitably gets to the point where its own pathologies slow down its progress, and then the sailboat has to tack in another direction and move away from the problems that were associated with that level. And so that's why it's growing, it's getting higher, but it's also cyclical in the sense that it's returning to the previous condition, but at a higher level. And so that's why this spiral of development is characteristic of spiral dynamics, because it's very dialectical in its structure, but also, as I'll talk about in week 8, this is in some ways representative of the larger structure of the evolving universe as a whole, which is a beautiful philosophical idea, which I look forward to sharing with you. Okay, so go to the next slide. So a formative feature of this new worldview that's trying to emerge right now on the horizon of history. Like many folks are happy with cultural intelligence. If they get that out of this course, I'll be happy. But there are other people who do feel kind of politically homeless at the moment. They don't feel comfortable within either of the parties. And they feel attracted. They feel, some even feel called to participate in the emergence of this next, what hope promises to be, if the pattern is true, if our interpretation of this, this larger pattern of emergence in culture is true, then something will emerge beyond progressivism, and it'll do that by being in a dialectical relationship with it, by pushing off against it, by being another turn on this spiral. And so the membrane between progressivism and post-progressivism is in some ways like the other worldviews, in that there's a there's a degree of difference and a degree of negative regard. However, the difference between the previous dialectical separations and this new one, the emergence of post-progressivism, is that post-progressives, they transcend by including, so their emergence is predicated upon the duty not to simply reject progressivism, not to be just anti-progressive, or to gain political will and credibility by just being an anti-progressive, right? So John McWhorter, who I mentioned, the black intellectual who's attacking progressivism, he's an anti-progressive. He's not appreciating the good and the bad. He's not using cultural intelligence, although I agree with many of his critiques. I think that there's a better way, and that better way is to work the dialectic between the progressive worldview and this post-progressive worldview in a way that exemplifies and demonstrates our knowledge of our duty to include. So I'll be talking about this throughout the rest of the course, but this difference between progressivism and post-progressivism, this important dialectical difference, this polarity, as illustrated here, is something to consider if you're trying to get your arms around what this next emergence is. It's the next step, something hopefully higher beyond progressivism. Okay, the final slide. Okay, this is just returning to this conception that I showed with the three main worldviews as just a way of understanding their demographics. This emergent worldview that hopefully integrates not only within itself, within its own left and right, but integrates the larger spiral as I've been talking about. And the best way to elaborate further on this worldview and what it means is to do it in the form of questions.